Hello and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'll be reviewing Longlegs, the newest film by Osgood Perkins, released on July 12th, 2024, distributed by Neon. The film was made on a budget of reportedly under $10 million, though we'll probably get a better, more accurate and updated number in the coming months. Within the confines of that modest budget, the film has already made over $22.8 million at the box office. This was the result of a clever and effective marketing strategy, starting with teasers a few months out, slowly unraveling more and more information and more videos, more cryptic sort of messages, very interesting, very disturbing content, right, that was being released. We also had the Birthday Murders website, thebirthdaymurders.net, I believe. This was a very effective little tool to explore and expand the lore of the movie without going too much into spoilers. It's a very interesting website and one that I've dedicated a number of hours looking into all the information. I've really been digging, all the marketing that this film has been doing and all the discussion around it, which has, of course, brought a number of new people that wouldn't have necessarily been that interested in a new independent art house horror film by Osgood Perkins. The film has gotten good reviews, but I also think there's been a little bit of a feeling of betrayal by more mainstream audiences that were going into this film expecting The Silence of the Lambs. Instead, they got this really off-kilter art house horror film that is drenched in this sort of satanic, disturbing mood, and not necessarily heavy on the action, which is of course Osgood Perkins' intention with this whole film. It's to make a film like Silence of the Lambs, to bring that familiar sort of tropes that you'd expect in a serial killer thriller, but then bring his own personal stuff within it, his own personal family story, as well as his own aesthetic tastes. This is something to do with The Black Coat's Daughter, right? He really loves this idea of giving the audience a little bit of what they expect, but in such an off-kilter way as to truly disturb them, to make them feel like they're watching something they shouldn't be watching, something that's not necessarily the comfort of a mainstream horror film, with the ebbs and flows of a roller coaster. With that being said, I love the success that this film is having. I'm very pleased. Not only is it good for Osgood Perkins' career and for Neon as a distribution company, that this is their biggest hit ever, but it's big for independent art house cinema, right? It's showing the pathway that these films can take into becoming mainstream hits, and this is going to be key for them to continue to survive in the theatrical distribution environment that we find ourselves in now. They're going to have to continue to follow the example that Longlegs showed. I hope this inspires different companies to have more and more clever and unique marketing techniques. Of course, we've already had the rise of A24, but I believe Neon is going to be a player in this scene as well, of independent art house horror cinema. I think this is a niche that I want to continue to see thrive. Of course, I love mainstream horror as well, but I also love this type of cinema as well. I think both being strong is a healthy sign for the horror environment more generally. I want a strong mainstream horror scene, and I want a strong art house scene, and I think both are really in a strong period right now and entering even a stronger period to come. I'm a huge James Wan fan. I'm a fan of Jordan Peele, Lee Winnell. There's a number of great mainstream horror directors, and I believe that we're going to continue to get great horror films from within the mainstream Hollywood system. I also believe that we have some great companies now that have some really talented directors in their stable that are going to continue to produce really interesting art house horror films. And I think Longlegs is going to continue that tradition, and it's going to be interesting here to see how Osgood Perkins' career develops. He, of course, has The Monkey coming out, which has James Wan involved. I love that kind of crossover. James Wan is going to be producing that film. I don't know necessarily, I'm assuming is Osgood Perkins, so it's not going to be fully within a mainstream aesthetic taste, but I wonder, I feel like Longlegs, while it still was very much within a Perkins type of film, it had a little bit more overture towards the mainstream, and this was seen, of course, in its marketing as well. So I'm curious to see how The Monkey is going to do with that sort of juggling between the art house sort of sensibilities that Osgood Perkins obviously has, as well as James Wan's more commercial sensibilities, right? He has a great sense of making horror films that have great commercial promise and potential that get realized time after time. I'm a big fan of The Black Coat's Daughter, which I made a video essay on, which I'll link here and I'll link in the description as well. I'm a big fan of Osgood Perkins. Not all of his films have worked as well as The Black Coat's Daughter, I believe, but this film, I'm very interested to talk to you guys about it, so let's dig into it. Film stars Mika Monroe, who's becoming something of a Scream Queen icon. Obviously, she starred in It Follows, right, the David Robert Mitchell film. She also starred in the pretty solid horror film by Chloe Okuno called Watcher. The film also stars Nicolas Cage, who also serves as a producer on the film. The rest of the cast is filled out by Blair Underwood, Alicia Witt, Michelle Choi Lee, and Dakota Dalby. Written and directed by Osgood Perkins, the film was produced by Dan Kagan, Brian Kavanaugh Jones, Nicolas Cage, Dave Kaplan, and Chris Ferguson. The film was obviously distributed by Neon and Black Bear International for international rights, and the film was released on July 12, 2024. The film was released 1 week after Maxine, so it's been a pretty interesting time for independent art house horror cinema. The film takes place in the 1990s following newly recruited FBI agent Lee Harker, who showcases psychic abilities in one of her early cases in which one of her partners is killed. The serial killer that she locates sort of gives up in a very mysterious way, almost as if he was expecting her to show up. This is one of the many questions that is left unanswered by the narrative that are kind of interesting to dig into later on, especially to see what kind of connections this could have to Longlegs. There is, of course, now the Longlegs murders. That is the whole point of the film, right? And it's her psychic abilities trying to unravel this case that has been going on for a number of years. The Longlegs doesn't necessarily kill the people himself, but instead is somehow connected through these letters he leaves at the crime scenes of family suicides, right? Murder-suicides, family annihilations, in which the father murders both of his daughters, or his daughter, right? It's always a daughter, and his wife, and then he kills himself. These are very disturbing crimes, very strong emotions, it seems to be played into them, right? Lots of stabbings, lots of blood, and just it's just very gruesome stuff that's going on. And this kind of ties it into the Silence of the Lambs sort of procedural elements that it's trying to go for. But this is kind of dropped off later on in the film as we really get into the supernatural elements, the psychic elements not only of our main character, Lee, but also what is Longlegs' whole plan, who's all connected, and how does Lee have anything to do with it. There's all sorts of really interesting angles that are kind of explored throughout the narrative that I find very interesting. We have a very spooky opening, right? The opening, before we get into the procedural elements, is very disturbing. We kind of get that first glimpse of Longlegs, and he is so disturbing. Nicolas Cage, in those small little moments, is very disturbing, very spooky, and sort of unreal in this way that is kind of hard to necessarily pinpoint. And then there's all these weird satanic elements as well that play into the narrative throughout. It all kind of comes together in a way that very much is reminiscent, not only of Silence of the Lambs, right? It has that sort of element, though that's dropped off, and we give rise to more of the Osgood Perkins of the whole thing, right? This is very similar to his very first film, The Blackcoat's Daughter, right? The whole satanic element of it all, the possession of it all, the murders, all these things, very sort of specific, right, ritualistic murders in ways that are trying to appease the devil, trying to do some sort of unreal, sort of supernatural, sort of different sort of thing outside of the realm of the standard serial killer that you would expect, or the standard killer in these types of films. This isn't necessarily like a slasher movie. This isn't a serial killer thriller. This is more of a slow burn, satanic panic kind of movie that takes elements from Silence of the Lambs, Seven, but more especially, I would say, Cure, Kiyoshi Kurosawa's masterpiece. That seems to be more of an influence even than some of the other films. That film is much more art housey than something like Silence of the Lambs or Seven, which are much more mainstream Hollywood horror films. So it's kind of playing within both. I would say the ending of the film really is more explanatory than a lot of Osgood Perkins' other films. It's sort of like he is giving a nod to sort of the mainstream audience he's trying to appeal with this film, while also still keeping some secrets for himself, keeping some secrets for the film that aren't necessarily all explained. We do get a bit of an exposition dump at the end, which I find lazy storytelling, which I'm not a fan of. That's my major critique of the film, is at the end, we do get that kind of exposition dump that explains the mother's connection to the murder, how she was an accomplice. I just don't think that's effective storytelling. I don't like that at all. I don't like that you have this awesome mystery going on, and then, we gotta stop everything for like a long scene in which they explain everything in very minute detail. But, I think ultimately, there's enough mystery still within the film. There's enough questions that you're lingering with. And there's also that dread that just totally seeps into your soul from this whole film's whole stylistic approach to horror that just is so disturbing and creepy in a way that doesn't feel like any other horror film you watch. Osgood Perkins has such a unique style that is so brutal, right? But in a way that's not necessarily like torture porn. It's not showing you everything. It's brutal in a way that is more brutal to the soul, brutal in a way spiritually, right? He definitely takes more of a religious angle on things and more of a supernatural element that really is disturbing in a way that is lingering, right? It's a lingering kind of horror that does remind me of Kiyoshi Kurosawa. That's why I brought him up. I think Cure is a very good representation of the types of films Osgood Perkins is trying to make. Cure is about a detective who is on the lookout for this serial killer, but it's weird because the serial killer is convincing other people to do the murders through hypnosis. So it's very similar to this film, I would say. With the major differences between the two films being Osgood Perkins' use of satanic imagery and satanic storytelling elements, right, which are very much a strong element of this film as well as The Black Coat's Daughter, which I believe are his two best films. He also has a much more personal take than I think Kiyoshi Kurosawa has. Kurosawa has broader social critiques, I think, embedded within his work, while Osgood Perkins is deeply personal within his work. With Perkins speaking in interviews about the effect that his parents and their lives with him and their tragic deaths had on a lot of his work, including in Black Coat's Daughter and then also in Longlegs. I also just want to praise for a moment this very effective scare that the film had, which was one of the most effective little jump scares. So we start with the opening, right? We have this opening with Longlegs and Nicolas Cage's character, right? And we kind of get our first introduction to him, and he's hanging out with Lee, and Lee takes the picture, and there's sort of this really creepy little moment at the beginning, right before the title card of the film. And then it's played back, right? We have a recurrence of that very moment in which Lee finds the Polaroid, right? We find it, and there's that little jump scare, and it's so effective. That was a very, very effective jump scare. One of the better uses of the jump scare technique in any horror film that I've seen in the last while, right? I really love like James Wan, and he really does jump scares at a very effective level. But this was a very effective usage of it in such a small dose. It was just that one really, really effective one, and I think it landed its punch really strongly. I also want to give enormous praise to Mika Monroe for her performance. She really is becoming worthy of the title of Scream Queen. I loved her performance in It Follows. I think she was very good in Watcher, right? Which I thought was a pretty good film. But in this film, she's really effective. She really gives a deep personality to the character. She does seem kind of off-kilter like the rest of the film. She doesn't necessarily fit within the sort of perfect FBI agent that you would expect. But she still is really, really interesting and has a deeper sort of emotional undercurrent to her whole character. Despite playing a sort of detached character, you kind of are always feeling like she's seeing things or feeling things, but she's not fully clear of what's going on. All these things are happening, and she can feel it because she has her psychic abilities, and they're right in front of her face, but she can't put the pieces together, and so she has this lingering dread throughout the whole film, such as in the beginning moment, right, when she goes in to the family, the Carter family's home, right, and they're all kind of hanging out. She's hanging out with the daughter, and she just feels dread. She can feel it. She doesn't know exactly what it is, but she knows something very bad's going to happen. It mirrors the audience's reaction throughout the film. We constantly have this lingering sense of dread throughout. It's a very sustained, long period of dread. We get a few moments of humor here and there that sort of lighten the mood, but for the most part, it's this very intense feeling that mirrors what the main character is going through, what Lee's going through, and I find that very effective. Nicolas Cage's performance, I think, is pretty effective. I mean, there is moments people think are kind of funny, and he's kind of over the top, but I like it. I think he is kind of an interesting character, and he sort of brings this weird maniacal energy to him. Yes, he's kind of goofy a little bit, but he's also disturbing at the same time. I think he's more effective in the small doses we get at the beginning. The more we see of him, I think the less scary he becomes, and the more... The scarier parts are more the effect that he's having in the sort of undercurrent of everything that's going on and the sort of supernatural elements that he's playing with. Not necessarily him himself, but I do find him scary, and I think part of that is because of how effective he was portrayed in the beginning in those small little doses. I think as we get further along and towards the end, it's not as scary, but it's still, he's so disturbing looking, and I can see why for some audience members it was just too ridiculous. Because I think it's kind of walking that fine line, right? And this is something that I think works with all of Osgood Perkins' films. His films are not meant for everyone. There's going to be very stark opinions, I think, and I think that's why there is some backlash to this film due to the marketing. They were expecting a certain type of film, and it's just so strongly something else. It's such a unique vision from Perkins. To me, that's all good horror. It's always going to be divisive. Horror necessarily is not going to always work within a mainstream context. A lot of the great horror films were very controversial, were very divisive, and I love that. And I really like this film. There is the critique I had about the exposition dump at the end, and just in general, I would have liked it to be a little bit more of a mysterious ending. But ultimately, I think there is still enough questions. There is still enough of that lingering dread as you leave the movie theater. You're still haunted by the film in a very strong way. And so I think this is a very effective film. I think this is exactly what Osgood Perkins was looking for. He made a very interesting off-kilter horror film that utilized techniques that would bring in a mainstream audience, expecting something that is familiar, such as a Silence of the Lambs or Seven type film, but instead getting this very deeply personal, supernatural, satanic panic, just freak show of a horror film that I thought was really cool. I also want to praise the performance by Kiernan Shipka. She did very good in her small role. She's a recurring actress, right, from The Black Coat's Daughter. I think she did another good job in this film. And in general, I just thought the performances all around were very effective. I think Perkins did a very good job with the writing and the directing. And I can't wait to see The Monkey and everything else that comes out from his career. So with that being said, leave your comments, your theories about the film. Leave them in the comment section below. I can't wait to hear. I love talking about this film, discussing it, and sort of parsing all the little details. So thank you guys all so much for watching, and see you next week.